Every building code in America was written to protect you. That's what they'll tell you. Except in 2026, at least 7 states are using those same codes, not to keep you safe, but to keep you connected. Connected to the grid, connected to the sewer line, connected to a system that charges you for the privilege of dependence. One state caps your rainwater at 2,500 gallons and puts your name on a registry. Another can legally force you to reconnect to the grid. I know that sounds like paranoia. It's not. These are actual statutes, actual enforcement patterns, actual fines. And the worst part? No single law in any of these states says the words off-grid living is banned. They don't have to. The architecture of regulation does it for them, quietly, structurally, and right now. Here's what makes this different from the usual list of best and worst states for homesteading. This isn't about friendly rankings or color-coded maps. This is about the specific mechanism each state uses to make self-sufficiency either illegal or financially unbearable. And every single one operates differently. One state caps how much rain you can collect from your own roof. Another lets you build your own cabin, but won't let you manage your own waste. A third, the sunniest state in the country, has laws designed to make it illegal not to be plugged into the electric grid. These aren't hypothetical scenarios. They're on the books. They're being enforced. And if you're planning any kind of off-grid life in 2026, you need to know exactly which doors are closing and how they're being locked. Let's start with a state that looks friendly on paper. North Carolina actually lets you install a composting toilet in your home. That sounds progressive, right? That sounds like a state that respects your right to handle your own waste. And if you stopped reading the statute right there, you'd think North Carolina was on your side. But keep reading. North Carolina's building codes require every residence to have what they call an approved wastewater system. And here's the trap. A composting toilet does not qualify as that approved system. You can add one to your home. The state is perfectly fine with that, but it doesn't count. Not as your primary wastewater solution, not as your backup. It's a decorative regulatory gesture. You still need either a connection to municipal sewer or a fully permitted septic system for grey water and backup black water disposal. The composting toilet you installed? It's extra. It's a bonus. It changes nothing about your legal obligations. Now think about what that means in practice. A permitted septic system installation in North Carolina runs anywhere from $3,000 to well over $10,000, depending on your county and your soil conditions. Sandy soil in the coastal plain? Maybe you get lucky on the lower end. Heavy clay in the Piedmont? You're looking at engineered systems, advanced treatment units, potentially $15,000 or more before you've flushed once. And this is required even if you have a perfectly functional composting toilet that produces no liquid waste whatsoever. The state essentially said, yes, you can have the technology. No, we won't let it replace the infrastructure we prefer. It's permission without function. A composting toilet in North Carolina is legally equivalent to a piece of furniture. And it doesn't stop at toilets. Rainwater collection for outdoor use, irrigation, livestock, washing, is legal and even encouraged by the state. North Carolina has no law against catching rain, but the moment you want to use that rainwater indoors, for drinking, for cooking, for bathing, it must comply with the state's plumbing code, which means filtration systems, testing, permits, inspections. The gap between legal and usable in North Carolina is filled with paperwork, fees, and soil percolation tests. Ask any local contractor who works in rural western North Carolina, and they'll tell you the same thing. People move out here thinking the mountains mean freedom. Then they meet the county inspector. The state's approach isn't hostile on the surface, it's welcoming, right up to the point where your independence actually threatens a conventional connection. That's when the fine print activates. And here's the thing that should bother you about North Carolina specifically. The state didn't ban composting toilets. It didn't ban rainwater. It absorbed them into the existing framework and neutralized them. That's a more sophisticated restriction than an outright ban, because you won't even realize you've been restricted until you're $8,000 deep in septic installation costs for a system you never wanted. North Carolina is the entry point on this list for a reason. It looks like the most permissive. It reveals the pattern. And that pattern only gets tighter from here. Move west, and the restriction changes form entirely. Utah's issue isn't about toilets or sewage. It's about the most basic substance on Earth, water. Specifically, the water that falls from the sky onto your own roof. Utah operates under a legal doctrine called prior appropriation. In plain English, that means all water in the state, every river, every stream, every raindrop, belongs to the state of Utah. Not to you, not to the landowner, to the state. This isn't some obscure colonial-era artifact nobody enforces. It's the operational foundation of Western water law, and in Utah, it extends all the way up to your gutters. Now, Utah does allow rainwater harvesting. It's one of the states that explicitly legalized it. But the details are where your off-grid plan dies. Without any registration, you are allowed to collect up to 100 gallons in no more than 2 containers. 100 gallons. That's roughly 10 days of water for a single person at strict conservation level usage. And that assumes you're doing nothing but drinking and minimal cooking. No bathing, no laundry, no garden. If you want more, you can register with the State Division of Water Rights and collect up to 2,500 gallons. That sounds like a meaningful amount until you do the math. A single person using water conservatively, we're talking military shower, hand-wash dishes conservative, needs around 10 gallons a day. That's 3,650 gallons a year. Your legal maximum with state registration doesn't cover one person for 1 year, and all of it, every drop of that 2,500 gallons, is restricted to non-potable use unless you treat it to full potable water standards, which means filtration systems, UV treatment, testing, and compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act at the state level. So let's be clear about what Utah is telling you. You can collect rain from your own roof, on your own land, that fell from the sky, that nobody created or transported, but only 2,500 gallons of it, only after you register with the state, and only for watering your garden or flushing a toilet. Want to drink it? Get a permit. Want more than 2,500 gallons? You're taking someone else's water, even though it never touched the ground before it hit your roof. I know that sounds insane. It's not. It's codified in Utah Code Section 73-3-1.5, and it's enforced. The honest caveat? Utah is actually better than it used to be. Before 2010, all rainwater harvesting was technically illegal in the state. The current framework is the result of reform, not restriction, and for conventional homes on municipal water who want a rain barrel for their tomatoes, the 100-gallon limit is perfectly adequate. The problem is specifically for anyone trying to live independently of municipal water infrastructure. For that person, Utah's permission is a ceiling so low you can't stand up under it. The state didn't ban rainwater collection. It legalized it within boundaries so tight that genuine water independence remains impossible, and it put your name on a state registry for the privilege. But at least Utah is honest about its mechanism. The next state on this list uses language so specific, it reads like it was written to target one lifestyle in particular. Indiana has a law on its books that every aspiring off-gridder in America should read. Not because it's long, not because it's complicated, because of one sentence. Indiana's state sewage regulations explicitly state, and I'm quoting directly, that the use of a composting or incinerating toilet in a residence is not a substitute for an on-site sewage system. Read that again. Is not a substitute. That's not ambiguous regulatory language. That's not a grey zone you can navigate with a clever permit application. That is the most explicit anti-composting toilet language on any state's books in the entire country. Indiana didn't imply it. Indiana didn't leave it to county interpretation. Indiana wrote it down in plain English and put a period at the end. Now here's where Indiana gets genuinely devious. The state has something called the log cabin rule. It sounds like freedom distilled into legislation. Under this rule, owner-built homes are exempt from certain provisions of the state building code. You can frame your own walls, you can wire your own circuits, you can roof your own house. The log cabin rule says, if you're building it yourself, on your own land, we'll cut you some slack on construction standards. But, And this is the critical word. The log cabin rule explicitly does not exempt you from sewage regulations. Indiana gave you the right to build your own cabin, then told you that you cannot manage your own waste inside it. You can swing the hammer, you cannot choose the toilet. The practical consequence? If a sanitary sewer line exists within what the state calls a reasonable distance of your property, connection is mandatory. Not recommended, not preferred, mandatory. And the installation of any on-site sewage system, septic, alternative, anything, is prohibited if that sewer line is within range. You don't get to choose septic over sewer, the state chooses for you. And what counts as reasonable distance? That's left undefined. There is no statewide standard, no number of feet, no number of miles. It's left entirely to county interpretation, which means your off-grid plan in rural Owen County might be perfectly legal, while the identical plan in Hamilton County gets you a violation notice and mandatory sewer connection fees. Residents in southern Indiana's hill country will tell you they've seen enforcement swing wildly from one county commission to the next. One year, nobody cares. Next year, new commissioner, new priorities, and suddenly your unpermitted composting toilet is a code violation. And here's the kicker that nobody talks about. Off-grid solar is effectively illegal in many parts of Indiana as well. The combination, you can't manage your own waste, and in many areas, you can't generate your own power, creates a state where the log cabin rule promises autonomy that the regulatory framework structurally prevents. Indiana let you build the cabin, it just won't let you live in it on your own terms. The log cabin rule is a door that opens into a wall, and unlike North Carolina, which at least lets your composting toilet exist as a symbolic addition, Indiana's statute closes that door with 7 words. Is not a substitute for an on-site sewage system. You'd think the desert Southwest would be different. You'd think the land of vast empty space and unregulated frontier would be the last place to restrict self-sufficiency. You'd be wrong. Arizona gets more sun than any other state in America, over 300 days of sunshine per year across most of the state. The Sonoran Desert is so consistently bathed in solar radiation that Arizona's solar potential per square foot exceeds every other state by a wide margin. If there's one state where generating your own electricity from the sun should be the easiest, most obvious, most legally straightforward thing in the world, it's Arizona. And yet, Arizona is described by off-grid advocates and legal analysts alike as one of the worst states in the country for off-grid solar. Not because the sun doesn't cooperate, because the laws are, and this language comes directly from policy analysis, not from me, written to make it illegal for a home not to be connected to the electric grid. Let that settle for a second. The sunniest state in America has structured its regulations so that disconnecting from the grid requires builders to apply for specific waivers from utility connection requirements. It's not automatic, it's not a right, it's a waiver, which means the default legal position is that your home must be connected to utility power. Solar panels on your roof don't change that obligation, and if you do stay connected, which the state functionally requires, and you install solar panels, you get hit with what's been widely described as a solar tax. This is a specific additional charge on your utility bill designed to offset what the utility companies call infrastructure costs. The argument? Even if you generate most of your own power, you still rely on the grid as backup, so you should pay for its maintenance. The practical effect? You're penalized for reducing your dependence. The less utility power you consume, the higher your per unit cost becomes. Now here's the irony that makes Arizona's position so revealing. The same state that restricts your ability to generate your own electricity actively encourages rainwater harvesting. Arizona has no restrictions on residential rainwater collection. In fact, the state mandates that commercial properties use rainwater for landscape irrigation in certain contexts. Arizona wants you to catch the rain. Arizona does not want you to catch the sun. Water falls from the sky. Take as much as you want. Light falls from the sky. That belongs to the utility company. The inconsistency isn't accidental. It reflects which resource has a powerful industrial lobby behind its distribution and which one doesn't. To be clear about what's still legal, Arizona does allow grid-tied solar systems, and the state has a significant solar industry. The restriction is specifically on grid independence, on the act of disconnecting entirely. If you want solar panels that feed into Arizona Public Service and reduce your bill, that's fine. If you want solar panels that replace APS entirely, you're in waiver territory. The distinction is between solar as a supplement and solar as liberation. Arizona permits the first and fights the second. The utility company's argument has a kernel of logic. Grid maintenance costs don't disappear because one customer generates their own power. But the effect on individual homesteaders is clear. In the state with the most solar potential in America, true energy independence requires navigating a regulatory framework designed to prevent exactly that. Arizona is the state that proves this list isn't about backwardness or ignorance. It's about economics. The sun is free, the infrastructure that distributes it is not, and someone is making sure you keep paying. If every other state on this list restricts one thing, water, waste, electricity, Mississippi does something more structural. It restricts the interaction between systems, and in doing so, it creates what might be the most effective off-grid ban in America without ever using the word ban. Start with electricity. Being disconnected from the electric grid appears to be illegal in most parts of Mississippi. That alone is restrictive, but it's a restriction shared with several states. Where Mississippi becomes unique is in what it does with sanitation on top of that electrical requirement. Composting toilets are legally recognized in Mississippi. So are pit privies. That sounds permissive, and it would be, except for the conditions attached. Both composting toilets and pit privies are limited to what the state defines as remote locations, or temporary and transient uses. And here's the clause that closes the trap. They are specifically prohibited in any building that has indoor plumbing and pressurized water. Think about what that means. If your home has running water, a sink, a shower, a garden hose connected to a pressure system, you cannot legally use a composting toilet. The state says, running water and composting toilets don't go together. Pick one. But if your home doesn't have running water, then it almost certainly fails habitability codes. A home without pressurized water in most Mississippi counties is not considered fit for human habitation, which means it can be condemned, which means you can be forced out. This is the double bind. You can have running water and be forced onto a conventional septic or sewer system, or you can skip running water and face condemnation for uninhabitable conditions. There is no middle path. There is no configuration of legal systems that allows full off-grid living in Mississippi, not because one law bans it, but because the interaction between electrical requirements and sanitation rules closes every door simultaneously. I want to be clear about something. Mississippi's rules weren't designed to target off-gridders. They were designed to ensure minimum habitability, to protect people from landlords who would rent homes without functioning plumbing or electricity. The intent was protective. The effect, decades later, is restrictive. And the effect is what matters when you're the one trying to live outside the system. Locals in rural Mississippi, particularly in the Delta counties and the Piney Woods, know this reality intimately. Plenty of people live in conditions that technically violate code, and enforcement has historically been lax in the state's poorest regions. But lax enforcement isn't the same as legal. It means your freedom exists at the pleasure of whatever code enforcement officer happens to drive by. It means one complaint from a neighbour, one new county inspector, one shift in local politics, and your off-grid homestead becomes a code violation overnight. Mississippi is the proof that you don't need a single law banning off-grid living. You just need two laws, one about electricity, one about toilets, that reference each other's conditions. The system doesn't have to be coordinated, it just has to be comprehensive. And Mississippi's is. But none of the above compares to the last two states on this list, because these two don't restrict one system. They've built entire regulatory architectures where off-grid is the deviation and grid connection is the legal default. New York's restriction isn't a single statute. It isn't one clever clause buried in sanitation code. It's the entire building code framework, applied uniformly, statewide, from Manhattan to the most remote cabin in the Adirondack backcountry. The instrument is called the Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code, and the key word is uniform. This code requires that all new buildings in the state of New York include plumbing and wastewater treatment. In practice, this means either connection to municipal water and sewer systems or a permitted well and septic system. A simple setup: rainwater collection for water, composting toilet for waste, solar for power, is unlikely to pass code inspection in most New York counties. Not because any one element is explicitly banned, but because the code assumes conventional infrastructure as the default. Everything else is a deviation that requires variances, exceptions, engineering reports, and inspections that most individual homesteaders cannot afford or navigate. And here's what makes New York different from every other state on this list. There is no county opt-out. The Uniform Code is exactly that: uniform. It applies in Brooklyn and it applies in Hamilton County, which has fewer than 5,000 residents spread across 1,720 square miles of Adirondack forest. The code that makes sense for dense Long Island suburbs, where unregulated wastewater would be a genuine public health crisis, applies with equal force to a 40-acre parcel in the North Country, where your nearest neighbour is a mile away, and the only thing downstream of your composting toilet is a stand of spruce trees. Off-grid solar faces its own barriers. In many areas of New York, off-grid solar installations exist in a regulatory grey zone that makes them difficult to permit for new construction. The state has developed microgrid statutes, legal frameworks for small-scale, localized power systems. But these are designed for communities, institutions and developers, not for individual homesteaders with a cabin and a dream. The complexity of navigating microgrid legislation is beyond what most people can manage without specialized legal counsel. Off-grid homes do exist in New York. Drive through the remote stretches of St. Lawrence County, Franklin County, the Western Adirondacks, and you'll find them. But they exist in legal grey zones, homes that were built before current code, or homes where enforcement simply hasn't reached, or homes whose owners have accepted the risk that any inspection could trigger a compliance order. Here's what's still technically possible. If you have enough money for an engineer, an attorney familiar with building code variances, and the patience to navigate a multi-year permitting process, you can potentially build an alternative infrastructure home in New York. The code allows for variances. The code allows for alternative compliance methods. But allows and facilitates are different words. A New York system is built around the second one only for conventional construction. The Uniform Code doesn't say off-grid is illegal. It says, here is what a legal home looks like. And that legal home has pipes connected to approved water sources and approved wastewater systems and approved electrical connections. Everything the code describes is conventional. Everything off-grid must argue its way in through the exception process. The default is dependency. Independence is the variance. For a state that contains some of the most remote wilderness east of the Mississippi, New York's building code operates as if every structure sits on a city block with utilities running past the curb. The code was built for density and applied to wilderness, and the people living in those remote Adirondack parcels, ask any of them, they'll confirm it, know they're one inspection away from a compliance notice that could cost more than their home is worth. That's New York, the comprehensive barrier state. But the final entry on this list is something else entirely, because in this state, the barrier isn't just the code, it's the utility company. And in this state, the utility company and the regulator are functionally the same entity. This is the state where everything converges, where the pattern this entire list has been building toward reaches its most concentrated form. Alabama doesn't just restrict off-grid living through building codes or water law or sanitation statutes. Alabama has created a framework where the dominant utility company operates with so little state oversight that challenging grid dependence isn't just difficult, it's practically designed to fail. Let's start with the baseline. In Alabama, disconnecting from the power grid appears to be illegal. That's not an interpretation. That's the structural reality as described by legal analysts, off-grid advocacy organizations, and residents who have tried. The mechanism is familiar. Building codes require electrical connections, habitability standards assume grid power, but in Alabama, the enforcement doesn't come primarily from the state. It comes from Alabama Power. Alabama Power is the dominant utility in the state, serving roughly 1.5 million customers, and Alabama Power charges high fees to customers who install solar panels. Not a small surcharge, not a token administrative cost, These are substantial additional charges that, according to multiple analyses, make Alabama one of the worst states in the entire country for off-grid solar. You can't leave the grid, and if you try to reduce your dependence while staying on it, your bill goes up. You're probably thinking, surely the state has consumer protections for this. Some kind of net metering law, some kind of solar rights statute, something. It doesn't. Alabama offers no state-mandated protections for solar users, no net metering requirements, no solar access laws, no mandatory buyback rates for excess power you generate and feed back into the grid. The utility sets the terms, the utility enforces the terms, and the state watches. This is what makes Alabama different from Arizona, which also restricts off-grid solar. Arizona at least has a regulatory commission that mediates between utilities and solar users. Alabama has created an environment where the utility is, for practical purposes, the regulator. The fox doesn't just guard the henhouse. The fox built the henhouse, wrote the rules of the henhouse, and charges the hens a fee for laying eggs. I know that sounds like hyperbole. It's not. The structure is documented. Alabama Power's parent company, Southern Company, is one of the largest utility holding companies in America and one of the most prolific political donors in the state. The regulatory environment didn't happen by accident. It was built, methodically, over decades, to protect a specific business model: centralized power generation sold to captive customers who cannot legally leave. Now, the honest caveat: rainwater harvesting in Alabama is legal. It's considered a property right. There are no state-level restrictions on collecting rainwater from your roof, storing it, or using it. If all you wanted was water independence, Alabama would be fine. The restriction is specifically, surgically, on electrical independence. Alabama says, your water is yours, your sunshine is not. Violations of building, electrical, and sanitation codes in Alabama can lead to fines, legal action, and, critically, forced compliance. The state can legally compel you to reconnect to the grid. Not suggest, not incentivize, compel. This is not theoretical. There are documented cases of Alabama residents facing legal pressure to restore grid connections after attempting to live off-grid. The cumulative picture is this: Alabama makes it appear illegal to disconnect. It charges you extra for trying to reduce consumption while connected. It offers no legal protections for solar users. It allows the dominant utility to set terms without meaningful state oversight, and it retains the legal authority to force you back onto the grid if you manage to leave. If you were designing a system, from scratch on a whiteboard, whose purpose was to ensure that no resident could ever achieve electrical independence, you would design Alabama's system. Every exit is blocked, every workaround is taxed, every alternative is unprotected, and the entity that benefits most from your dependence is the same entity that writes the rules governing your options. That's not a building code, that's not a health regulation, that's a business model with the force of law behind it, and in 2026, it's still operating exactly as designed. 7 states, 7 mechanisms. Not one of them uses the words, off-grid living is banned. They don't have to. The question isn't whether these regulations exist. They're on the books right now. The question is whether you found out before or after you signed the deed. Which state caught you off guard? Drop it in the comments. And if this is the kind of research that keeps you from learning the hard way, subscribe.